let's get on to the last question for this week to do with vaccines, and so this is a question that's near to my heart, but I'm interested to hear what others have to say about this. So this is a question that came from Samson, which was how efficient is vaccination once an epidemic has started? And so I'm going to kick this one off because I said that this is a question that's near and dear to my own heart. And so, from a population dynamics standpoint, I think we can certainly quantify the direct and indirect benefits of vaccination. So we know the direct protection that's afforded by vaccination to that individual. We can quantify the herd immunity consequences, how much secondary benefit is given to the population, and so conceptually we can identify these potential benefits, but practically implementing those and knowing when to use vaccination and when vaccination is beneficial relative to other potential interventions becomes a real challenge. And the reason this is of interest to me is this is something that I've been involved with for a number of years in trying to quantify the impact of vaccine response for measles in the developed world. And I've worked with aid organizations to try and retrospectively analyze what were the gains or savings in terms of cases avoided or lives saved by intervening in the beginning of an outbreak and vaccinating, and can we quantify that short-term benefit or that secondary benefit? And the outcomes of that have been sort of twofold. We've shown that clearly if you get there fast enough, if you can detect epidemics quickly, then you absolutely can have this secondary benefit. And this was instrumental in changing the World Health Organization guidelines for measles outbreak response in 2005, where we actually advocated for the use of vaccination in measles outbreak response. But the downside is that you have to be able to react quickly. You have to have programs in place in advance, and in fact, from the analyses that we did, we found that many of the outbreaks for which there had been responses, quantitatively the response wasn't that impactful. We were talking about maybe a 5 to 10% reduction in overall cases, and that's largely because it took too long to respond because the systems were not in place, and the outbreaks were on their way down anyway, and so the vaccination wasn't able to achieve its full benefit. And so there are a lot of practical considerations in terms of how you use vaccination judiciously in a response scenario.
I think just as a cruel rule of thumb, isn't it right that effectively once the epidemic starts to become self-limiting, so if you're coming in after the epidemic is starting to recede, then typically there's very little that you gain from vaccinating. Whereas, so it's really whatever you can do before the epidemic starts becoming self-limiting is really the critical window of opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how long is that? Just to remind all of us again, like how long are we talking about this?
Also, it's going to depend on every population and every pathogen, right? So the duration of that epidemic is going to be a function of the size of the susceptible population, the magnitude of R naught, and a variety of other considerations like the seasonality. So
infectious period,
as well. Mm-hmm. So we were working. Some of this work we were doing in sub-Saharan Africa, where there are real strong seasonal cycles in terms of how people are moving into and out of cities, and so when population density is declining as people are moving out to start farming again for the year, the outbreak is self-limiting in and of itself, and so additional vaccination at that point wasn't really going to do a great big job, have a great additional benefit.
But just even one example, like the window that you really needed to have for when you were talking about for measles, how long of a window are we talking about here?
Again, it depends. I think even in the best case scenarios, you're talking about a month at best.
Yeah. So this is the parameter in terms of pragmatics. Is if you have a month, right? A month before this is really like you've hit the curve. How can we get any system up for speed for something like mass levels of vaccination, having enough vaccine out there making sure that all the sanitation is there for all the needles that are going to be used. That is an incredible amount of effort.
Yeah.
So when we tried to gear up for smallpox, there were all of these emergency disaster kinds of scenarios played out just to try and figure out, well, if you were going to try to vaccinate a particular community, well, who's even available to see everybody? Well, maybe teachers, and they tried to get all the teachers in, and they tried to train all these teachers who've never had any training in anything like this to figure out how to get people in, get them into line, check people off, figure out who would have needles, how many people do we really have who can handle a needle. So all of this, I know a month, I mean, even if I realize it can go back and forth, but just so we have some discussion of what are we trying to gear everybody up to do, that is very difficult for something in this kind of a scenario.
And that, of course, was the reason why early on WHO didn't advocate outbreak response vaccine campaigns, just because the logistics was such that, realistically, it was going to be hard to get in there. Now, interestingly, I think that have changed, and so that's why WHO also has changed their guidelines, because now I've worked a lot with Doctors Without Borders, for example, and I think you will know the numbers better, but it's incredible the swiftness by which once they decide we need to intervene, the number of days that it takes them actually to get all the kit together, get all the doctors together, get the planes and helicopters together and be on the ground in some of the worst places in the world. It's just staggering. They can do it so fast. It's just incredible.
Yeah. And that's what's actually so brilliant about this group, right, is they're not reinventing this every time. They have perfected how to gear up quickly and to move their resources to a new location. It's a lot of this new trying to get a community to realize what it might be like. Reinventing this wheel. And we do have so many great models now, but we don't have to.
Yeah, and I think Rachel's points are well taken about the limitations of communications, and that in many of these communities, the reason that aid organizations like MSF and UNICEF and ICRC, the reason they can respond so quickly and ramp up so quickly is because of existing relationships they have with the Ministry of Health. They've already talked through these scenarios, and so there's an understanding about how fast decisions have to get made and how fast things have to get implemented, right? And so I think these kinds of discussions about what are the limitations, what are the epidemiological consequences, and what are the public health benefits, right, I think are exceedingly important in advance, right? It's really, really challenging to advocate for these things in real time, but if you can set up these relationships in advance, then you have a far better job of being able to respond in that case.
Being able to diagnose that first case and actually getting the first case for these infectious diseases that we know a lot about how they spread once they get going, but often because of our detection mechanisms, we don't find the first cases. It's already pretty on the exponential side. And it's interesting to think what we can do with some of the social media. Now, if that is a way to really improve the time of detection, to get it down so we can get that first case. And then, I'm curious how that changes these equations, because you do have sort of a long period before we typically think about these as outbreaks.
You certainly have you can certainly have that time period now to begin the discussion and to start laying the logistical groundwork, I think, for doing these things. And just as an interesting counterpoint to this, I think, is the story of H1N1 a few years ago, where there was rapid detection, there was massive ramping up of public health response around the world, and the outbreak turned out to not be as big or as bad as everybody was concerned with. And I think that it's this challenging thing. If we do a good job, these outbreaks should be small, right? So not seeing a big outbreak should be an indication of a positive benefit, right? But there was a lot of negative public response following H1N1. The UK government was heavily criticized for instituting vaccination and spending all of this money in amassing antiviral drugs.